He sat there in his $3,000 suit, laughing with his high-priced shark of a lawyer, pointing at the empty chair beside his wife. Keith thought the divorce was already over. He thought stripping Grace of her bank accounts meant she would crumble. He even told the judge she was too incompetent to hire counsel. But Keith forgot one crucial detail about Grace's past, specifically, who gave birth to her. When the courtroom doors swung open and she walked in, the smirk didn't just vanish from Keith's face, the color drained from his entire existence. You are about to witness the most brutal courtroom takedown in history. The air inside courtroom 304 of the Manhattan Civil Courthouse was stale, smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper. It was the scent of ending things. For Keith Simmons, however, the atmosphere smelled like victory. Keith adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, leaning back in the leather chair at the plaintiff's table. He checked his watch, a vintage Patek Philippe that cost more than the average American's car, and let out a sharp, derisive exhale through his nose. "She's late," Keith whispered to the man beside him. Or maybe she finally realized it's cheaper to just give up. Beside him sat Garrison Ford. Garrison wasn't just a lawyer, he was a weapon. Senior partner at Ford, Miller and O'Connell, he was known in New York legal circles as the Butcher of Broadway. He didn't just win divorce cases, he incinerated the opposition until there was nothing left but ash and a favorable settlement. Garrison smoothed his silver tie, his eyes scanning the docket with predatory boredom. "It doesn't matter if she shows up, Keith," Garrison murmured, his voice like gravel grinding on glass. "We filed the emergency motion to freeze the joint assets on Monday. She has no access to liquidity. No retainer means no representation. No representation against me means she walks away with whatever scraps we decide to toss her." Keith smirked, looking across the aisle. Sitting there, alone, was Grace. She looked smaller than Keith remembered. She wore a simple, charcoal grey dress that she'd owned for years. Her hands were folded neatly on the scarred oak table, her fingers interlaced so tightly that her knuckles were white. There were no stacks of files in front of her, no paralegals whispering strategy, no pitcher of ice water, just Grace, staring straight ahead at the empty judge's bench. "Look at her," Keith chuckled, loud enough for the few spectators in the back to hear. "Pathetic. I almost feel bad for her. It's like watching a deer waiting for a semi-truck." "Focus," Garrison warned, though a small smile played on his lips. "Judge Henderson is a stickler for decorum. Let's get this done quickly. I have a lunch reservation at Le Bernardin at 1. Don't worry, Garrison. By 1 o'clock, I'll be a free man, and she'll be looking for a studio apartment in Queens." The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Officer Kowalski, who had seen enough divorces to lose faith in humanity twice over, bellowed out, "All rise. The Honorable Judge Lawrence P. Henderson presiding." The room shuffled to its feet. Judge Henderson swept in, his black robes billowing. He was a man of sharp angles and short patience, known for clearing his docket with ruthless efficiency. He took his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and peered down at the parties. "Be seated," Henderson commanded. He opened the file in front of him. "Case number 24, Civ 0091, Simmons versus Simmons. We are here for the preliminary hearing regarding the division of assets and the petition for spousal support." Henderson looked at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Ford, good to see you again." "And you, Your Honor," Garrison said, standing smoothly. "We are ready to proceed." The judge turned his gaze to the defense table. He frowned. Grace stood up slowly. "Mrs. Simmons," Judge Henderson said, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "I see you are alone. Are you expecting counsel?" Grace cleared her throat. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly. I am, Your Honor." She should be here any minute. Keith let out a loud, theatrical scoff. He covered his mouth with his hand, but the sound was unmistakable. Judge Henderson's eyes darted to Keith. "Is there something amusing, Mr. Simmons?" Garrison Ford stood up immediately, placing a restraining hand on Keith's shoulder. "Apologies, Your Honor. My client is simply frustrated. This process has been dragged out, and the strain is significant." "Keep your client's frustration silent, Mr. Ford," the judge warned. He turned back to Grace. "Mrs. Simmons, court began 5 minutes ago. You know the rules. If your attorney is not present—" "She's coming," Grace insisted, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. "There was traffic." "Traffic," Keith muttered, leaning forward so his voice carried across the aisle. "Or maybe the check bounced, Grace?" "Oh wait, you can't write a check. I cancelled the cards this morning." "Mr. Simmons," the judge banged his gavel, "one more outburst and I will hold you in contempt." "My apologies, Your Honor," Keith said, standing up and buttoning his jacket, feigning humility. I want to be fair here. My wife is clearly confused. She doesn't understand the complexity of the law. She has no income, no resources. I offered her a generous settlement last week, $50,000 and the 2018 Lexus. She refused. Keith turned to look at Grace, his eyes cold and dead. "I tried to help you, Grace, but you insisted on playing games. Now look at you, sitting there with nothing. You don't have a lawyer because nobody wants a charity case." "Mr. Ford, control your client," Judge Henderson snapped. "Your Honor," Garrison Ford interjected smoothly, "while my client's passion is regrettable, his point is valid. We are wasting the court's time. Mrs. Simmons clearly has not secured representation. Under the precedent of Vargas versus State, we move to proceed immediately with a default judgment on the asset division. She has had months to prepare." Judge Henderson looked at Grace. He looked tired. "Mrs. Simmons, Mr. Ford is technically correct. The court's time is valuable. If you cannot produce an attorney right now, I have to assume you are representing yourself, pro se. And given the complexity of the forensic accounting involved in your husband's estate, that would be ill-advised." "I am not representing myself," Grace said, her eyes fixed on the double mahogany doors at the back of the room. "Please, just 2 more minutes." "She's stalling," Keith hissed. "She's got nobody. Her father was a mechanic, and her friends are all suburban housewives. Who is she going to call? Ghostbusters?" Keith laughed again, a cruel, barking sound. He felt invincible. He looked at Grace, the woman he had vowed to love and cherish, and saw only an obstacle he was about to crush. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted her to know that leaving him was the biggest mistake of her life. "Your Honor," Garrison pressed, sensing the kill. "I move to strike her request for a continuance. Let's end this charade." Judge Henderson sighed. He picked up his gavel. "Mrs. Simmons, I'm sorry. We cannot wait any longer. We will proceed with—" Bam! The double doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the frames. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Everyone turned. Keith spun around in his chair, annoyed at the interruption. Garrison Ford frowned, his pen hovering over his notepad. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Standing in the doorway was not a frazzled public defender. It was not a cheap strip mall lawyer. Standing there was a woman who looked to be in her late 60s, though her posture was as rigid as a steel beam. She wore a tailored white suit that cost more than Keith's entire wardrobe. Her silver hair was cut into a sharp, terrifyingly precise bob. She wore dark sunglasses, which she slowly removed, revealing eyes of piercing, icy blue. Eyes that had stared down senators and CEOs. Behind her walked 3 junior associates, all carrying thick leather briefcases, moving in a V formation like fighter jets, escorting a bomber. The woman didn't rush. She walked down the center aisle, the click of her heels sounding like a metronome counting down Keith's remaining time on Earth. Garrison Ford, the butcher of Broadway, dropped his pen. His mouth opened slightly. His face, usually a mask of arrogance, went pale. "No," Garrison whispered, a genuine tremor in his voice. "That's impossible." "Who is that?" Keith asked, confused by his lawyer's reaction. "Is that her mum?" "Grace's mum is dead. She told me she was an orphan." The woman reached the defense table. She didn't look at Grace. She didn't look at the judge. She turned slowly and looked directly at Keith Simmons. She smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile a shark gives before it drags a seal into the depths. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice smooth, cultured, and projecting to every corner of the room without a microphone. "I had to file a few motions with the Supreme Court regarding your finances, Mr. Simmons. It took longer than expected to list all your offshore accounts." Keith froze. Judge Henderson leaned forward, his eyes wide. "Counselor, state your name for the record." The woman placed a gold-embossed business card on the stenographer's desk. She turned to the judge. "Catherine Bennett," she said, "Senior Managing Partner at Bennett, Crown and Sterling of Washington, D.C. I am entering my appearance as counsel for the defendant." She paused, then looked at Keith again. "And," she added, "I am also her mother." The silence that followed Catherine Bennett's introduction was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually follows a bomb blast. Keith Simmons blinked, his brain trying to process the information. "Mother?" he stammered, looking from the imposing woman in white to his trembling wife. "Grace, you said your mother was... You said she was gone." Grace finally looked up, her eyes wet but her chin high. "I said she was gone from my life, Keith. I didn't say she was dead. We were estranged. Until yesterday." "Estranged," Catherine Bennett repeated, the word rolling off her tongue like a verdict. She moved around the defense table, taking the chair beside Grace. She didn't hug her daughter. Not yet. This was business. She placed a heavy briefcase on the table and snapped the latches open. Grace left home 20 years ago to escape the pressure of my world. She wanted a simple life. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not the Bennett name. Catherine turned her gaze to Garrison Ford. The opposing lawyer was currently trying to make himself look smaller in his chair. "Hello, Garrison," Catherine said pleasantly. "I haven't seen you since the Oracle Tech merger litigation in 2015. You were barely an associate then, weren't you? Fetching coffee for the real lawyers?" Garrison Ford cleared his throat, his face flushing a deep red. "Ms. Bennett, it is an honor. I didn't know you were admitted to the bar in New York." "I am admitted to the bar in New York, California, D.C., and before the International Court of Justice in The Hague," she replied, not breaking eye contact. "I generally handle constitutional law and multi-billion-dollar corporate mergers. But when my daughter called me weeping, telling me that a mid-level marketing executive with a Napoleon complex was bullying her," Catherine paused, letting the insult land. "I decided to make an exception." "Objection!" Keith yelled, standing up. Panic was starting to set in. "Personal attack. Who does she think she is?" "Sit down, Mr. Simmons," Judge Henderson barked. The judge looked at Catherine with a mix of reverence and fear. Everyone in the legal world knew the name Catherine Bennett. She was known as the Iron Gavel. She had argued 14 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and won 12. She was a myth. "Ms. Bennett," Judge Henderson said, his tone respectful. "While your reputation precedes you, we are in the middle of a hearing regarding asset division. Mr. Ford has filed a motion for default judgment." "Yes, I saw that motion," Catherine said, pulling a file from her briefcase. "It was cute, sloppy but cute." She stood up and walked toward the bench, handing a thick stack of documents to the bailiff to give to the judge. She dropped a duplicate stack onto Garrison Ford's desk with a heavy thud. "Mr. Ford claims my client has no assets and no representation. That is now moot. Furthermore, Mr. Simmons claims that the assets in question, the penthouse on Fifth Avenue, the house in the Hamptons, and the portfolio at Goldman Sachs, are his sole property, protected by a prenuptial agreement signed 7 years ago." "That prenup is ironclad," Keith shouted. "She gets nothing. She signed it." Catherine turned to Keith. She took off her glasses again. "Mr. Simmons, do you know who wrote the standard template for the spousal coercion clause used in the state of New York?" Keith blinked. "What?" "I did," Catherine said softly. "In 1998, I drafted the legislation that defines exactly what constitutes coercion when signing a marital contract." She tapped the document on Garrison's table. "And according to the sworn affidavit my daughter provided this morning, you threatened to kill her cat and cut off her access to her sick grandmother's nursing home funds if she didn't sign that paper the night before the wedding." The courtroom gasped. "That's a lie!" Keith screamed, his face turning purple. "She's a liar!" "We also have the text messages from that night," Catherine continued, her voice rising just enough to cut through his shouting. "Recovered from the cloud server you thought you wiped. Exhibit C, Your Honor." Judge Henderson flipped to Exhibit C. His eyebrows shot up. Garrison Ford was flipping through the pages frantically. Sweat was beading on his forehead. "Your Honor, we haven't had time to review this evidence. This is an ambush." "An ambush?" Catherine laughed. It was a terrifying sound. "Mr. Ford, you tried to default judgment a woman with no lawyer while your client mocked her to her face. You don't get to complain about fairness. Now, let's talk about the finances." Catherine turned back to the gallery, addressing the room as if she were lecturing a class of law students. "Mr. Simmons claims his net worth is roughly $8 million, a respectable sum for a man of his limited talents." Keith looked like he was about to have a stroke. "However," Catherine said, pulling out a second, thicker binder, "my team of forensic accountants, who, by the way, usually track terrorist financing for the Pentagon, spent the last 12 hours tracing the intricate web of shell companies Mr. Simmons set up in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus." She dropped the second binder. Thud. "It appears, Your Honor, that Mr. Simmons has been funneling marital assets into a holding company called Apex Ventures for 5 years. The total amount hidden is not $8 million. Catherine leaned in close to Keith, her face inches from his. "It's $24 million, and since you failed to disclose it on your financial affidavit, signed under penalty of perjury this morning..." Catherine smiled at the judge. "That constitutes felony fraud." Keith slumped back into his chair. He looked at Garrison. "Do something!" he hissed. Garrison Ford looked at the documents. He looked at the judge, who was glaring at Keith with burning intensity. Then he looked at Catherine Bennett, who was checking her manicured nails. "I need a recess," Garrison croaked. "Request denied," Judge Henderson said instantly. "I want to hear more about these Cayman accounts. Ms. Bennett, please proceed." Catherine smoothed her skirt. "Thank you, Your Honor. But before we get to the fraud, I'd like to address the matter of the mockery my client endured regarding her lack of a lawyer." She walked back to Grace and placed a hand on her shoulder. For the first time, Grace looked up at her mother and smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile. "Keith," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a conversational, almost intimate tone. "You mocked my daughter because you thought she was weak. You thought that because she is kind, she is defenseless. You mistook her silence for surrender." Catherine turned to the court reporter. "Let the record show," she stated clearly, "that Grace Simmons is now represented by Catherine Bennett. And I am not here to negotiate a settlement, Mr. Ford." She looked at Keith, her eyes flashing with a cold, hard light. "I am here to take everything. The house, the cars, the hidden money, the reputation. I am going to peel your life apart, layer by layer, until you are left with exactly what you tried to leave my daughter with. Nothing." "Mr. Ford," Catherine said, gesturing to the podium, "your witness." The courtroom air had shifted. It was no longer stale. It was electric. The few spectators in the back, mostly bored law clerks and retirees, were now leaning forward, their phones out, texting friends that something major was happening in courtroom 304. Judge Henderson rubbed his temples. "Mr. Ford, do you wish to cross-examine?" "Well, I suppose there is no witness yet. Ms. Bennett, you have the floor." "Thank you, Your Honor," Catherine said, standing tall. "I call Keith Simmons to the stand as a hostile witness." Keith froze. He looked at Garrison Ford. "Do I have to?" "You're the plaintiff, you idiot," Garrison whispered harshly, wiping sweat from his upper lip. "Get up there. And for the love of God, don't lie. She knows everything." Keith walked to the witness stand. His legs felt heavy. He sat down, and the bailiff swore him in. He looked out at the court, trying to regain his composure. He was Keith Simmons. He was a successful businessman. He was the man who made the deals. This old woman was just bluffing. Catherine walked to the podium. She didn't bring any papers. She just rested her hands on the wood and looked at him. "Mr. Simmons," she began, her voice deceptively light. "Let's talk about the traffic you mentioned earlier. The traffic that delayed my daughter." Keith scoffed nervously. "It was a figure of speech. She's always late. She's disorganized." "Disorganized?" Catherine repeated. "Is that why you handled all the finances in the marriage? Because Grace was too disorganized to understand numbers?" "Exactly," Keith said, gaining confidence. "Grace is a dreamer. She paints. She volunteers at the animal shelter. She doesn't understand ROI or equity positions. I did everything to protect our future." "To protect your future?" Catherine nodded. "Is that why you purchased a condo in Miami on March 14th of this year? The one listed under Simmons Holdings, LLC? Keith blinked. That was an investment property for the portfolio." "Strange," Catherine said, "because according to the credit card statements associated with that property, statements you tried to shred, but which your assistant, poor overworked Ms. Higgins, forgot to delete from the digital recycling bin, you bought furniture for a nursery." Grace gasped in the gallery. Her hand flew to her mouth. Keith turned pale. It was staging, for resale value." "Staging," Catherine said, stepping closer. "And the diamond tennis bracelet purchased from Tiffany's on 5th Avenue 3 days later? Was that for staging too? Or was that for the woman living in the condo?" "Objection." Garrison Ford stood up, though he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Relevance, Your Honor. New York is a no-fault divorce state. Infidelity doesn't impact the division of assets." "It does when marital funds were used to facilitate it," Judge Henderson ruled, his eyes narrowing at Keith. "Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Simmons." Keith gripped the railing of the witness box. I don't know what she's talking about." Catherine smiled. It was the smile of a predator who tasted blood. "You don't? Okay. Let's move on from the mistress for a moment. We'll circle back to Sasha later." Keith flinched at the name. Let's talk about your company, Apex Ventures, Catherine continued. You swore in your affidavit that your income last year was $400,000. That's correct, Keith said quickly. The market was down. The market was down, Catherine mocked. She turned to the jury box, which was empty, as this was a bench trial. Then back to the judge. Your Honor, I have here bank records from the First National Bank of Cyprus. They show a wire transfer of $2 million entering an account controlled by Apex Ventures on the exact same day Mr. Simmons claimed the market was down. She held up a piece of paper. And here is the withdrawal slip. Mr. Simmons, can you tell the court what you used that $2 million for? Keith stayed silent. His throat was dry. I'll help you, Catherine said. You bought cryptocurrency. Specifically, an untraceable coin that you stored on a cold storage hard drive. A hard drive that is currently sitting in a safety deposit box at the Grand Central branch of Chase Bank, box number 404. Keith's jaw dropped. How did you? I'm Catherine Bennett, she said simply. Finding money is what I do. Now here is the problem, Keith. You didn't declare that $2 million. You didn't declare the crypto, and you certainly didn't share it with your wife. Catherine leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the silent room. You mocked my daughter for not having a lawyer. You thought she was stupid. But the only stupid thing in this room, Keith, is thinking you could steal $2 million, hide it in a box, and then parade your girlfriend around Miami while my daughter clipped coupons to buy groceries. I didn't steal it, Keith shouted, cracking under the pressure. It's my money. I earned it. She just sat at home, painting stupid pictures. She didn't contribute anything. Why should she get half of my genius? The courtroom went dead silent. Judge Henderson looked at Keith with pure disgust. Mr. Simmons, did you just admit on the record that the money exists and that you intentionally hid it to prevent your wife from receiving her equitable share? Keith looked at the judge, then at Garrison. Garrison had his face buried in his hands. Keith stammered. No further questions for this witness, Catherine said, turning her back on him. She walked back to the table and sat down next to Grace. Grace was crying silently. Catherine reached out and took her daughter's hand, squeezing it tight. It's okay, Catherine whispered. He's done. Garrison Ford was a man who prided himself on survival. He had navigated the treacherous waters of New York high society divorces for 20 years. He knew when to fight, when to settle, and, most importantly, when to cut a rope to save his own neck. As Keith Simmons stumbled down from the witness stand, looking like a man who had just gone 12 rounds with a heavyweight boxer, Garrison was already doing the mental calculus. Keith had just admitted to perjury and fraud in open court. The judge was furious, and sitting across the aisle was Catherine Bennett, a woman who had the power to not only win this case, but to file ethics complaints that could strip Garrison of his license. Garrison, Keith hissed as he collapsed into his chair. Fix this. Do something. Object to the hard drive evidence. Say it was obtained illegally. Garrison didn't look at his client. He began packing his briefcase. What are you doing? Keith asked, panic rising in his voice. Garrison stood up. He buttoned his jacket. Your Honor, Garrison said, his voice steady. At this time, I must respectfully move to withdraw as counsel for the plaintiff, Mr. Simmons. Keith's eyes bulged. What? You can't quit. I paid you a $50,000 retainer. Mr. Simmons, Judge Henderson said, peering over his spectacles. We are in the middle of a hearing. This is highly irregular. Your Honor, Garrison continued, choosing his words carefully to avoid violating privilege while saving his own skin. An ethical conflict has arisen that makes it impossible for me to continue representing this client. As an officer of the court, I cannot suborn perjury. Based on the testimony my client just gave, my continued representation would compromise my professional obligations. Translation: he lied, he got caught, and I'm not going down with him. "You coward!" Keith screamed. He lunged at Garrison, grabbing the lawyer's lapel. "I pay you! You work for me!" "Bailiff!" Judge Henderson shouted. Officer Kowalski moved with surprising speed for a big man. He grabbed Keith by the back of his expensive suit and slammed him back into his chair. "Sit down and shut up, or you're going to a holding cell," Kowalski growled. Keith sat, breathing heavily, his tie askew. He looked around the room. He was alone. Truly alone. Judge Henderson looked at Garrison. "Mr. Ford, I am not granting your withdrawal at this moment. You will sit there, and you will ensure your client's rights are protected until this hearing concludes. After that, you can file whatever motions you want. But you are not leaving this courtroom." Garrison's face fell, but he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." He sat down, moving his chair a distinct 2 feet away from Keith. Catherine Bennett watched this display with a cool detachment. She stood up again. "Your Honor," she said, "since Mr. Simmons's counsel is still present, albeit reluctantly, I would like to call my next witness. This witness goes to the issue of character, specifically regarding Mr. Simmons's petition for spousal support, which, I might add, he had the audacity to file against my daughter." "Call your witness," the judge said, sounding exhausted. "I call Sasha Miller," Catherine said. Keith's head snapped up. "No," he whispered. "She wouldn't." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened again. A young woman walked in. She was stunningly beautiful, wearing a modest navy dress. She looked terrified. She walked past Keith without looking at him. Keith reached out a hand. "Sasha, baby, don't." She flinched away from him, as if he were radioactive. Sasha took the stand. She was sworn in. "Ms. Miller," Catherine said gently, "thank you for coming. I know this is difficult. Can you tell the court your relationship to the plaintiff, Keith Simmons?" Sasha took a shaky breath. I was his girlfriend for the last 2 years. "Was?" Catherine asked. "Yes," Sasha said, her voice gaining strength. "I broke up with him this morning." "Why did you break up with him this morning, Miss Miller?" Sasha looked at Keith. Her eyes were filled with tears, but also with anger. "Because," she said, her voice trembling, "because Mrs. Bennett showed me the text messages Keith sent to his other girlfriend in Chicago." The courtroom erupted. Even the judge looked shocked. "Order!" Judge Henderson banged the gavel. "Order!" Keith looked like he was going to be sick. "Ms. Miller," Catherine continued, unfazed by the noise. "Did Mr. Simmons ever discuss his wife, Grace, with you?" "All the time," Sasha said. "He told me she was crazy. He said she was a burden. He said—" She paused, looking at Grace with pity. "He said he was going to destroy her in court. He bragged about it. He said he was going to leave her with nothing, just for the sport of it. He called it taking out the trash." Grace covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. "He told me," Sasha continued, her voice rising, "that he had a lawyer who was a killer and that Grace was too stupid to fight back. He said he was going to make her homeless, so she would have to come crawling back to him, begging for help. He said he wanted to own her." Catherine let the words hang in the air. They were ugly, they were cruel, and they were the final nail in Keith's coffin. "Thank you, Miss Miller," Catherine said softly. "No further questions." Catherine turned to Garrison Ford. "Cross-examination?" Garrison looked at Keith, who was staring at the table, defeated. Garrison looked at the judge. "No questions, Your Honor." Judge Henderson took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a microfiber cloth. He didn't look at the papers in front of him. He looked at Keith Simmons. "Mr. Simmons," the judge began, his voice dangerously low, "in my 20 years on the bench, I have seen some truly despicable behavior. I have seen people fight over dogs, over silverware, over children. But I have rarely seen a display of arrogance and malice quite like this." Keith didn't look up. "You came into my courtroom," the judge continued, his voice rising, "and you mocked the judicial process. You mocked your wife. You attempted to weaponize this court to abuse a woman you swore to protect. You committed perjury. You committed fraud." The judge turned to Grace. "Mrs. Simmons, I owe you an apology. The court should have protected you sooner." Grace nodded, wiping her eyes. Catherine put an arm around her. "However," Judge Henderson said, putting his glasses back on, "I am now in a position to rectify that." He picked up his pen. "I am issuing a temporary ruling immediately. The final judgment will follow once Ms. Bennett's team completes a full forensic audit of Mr. Simmons's assets, every single penny. First," the judge ruled, "I am freezing all assets belonging to Keith Simmons, Apex Ventures, and any other entity he controls. Access is granted solely to Mrs. Simmons and her counsel." Keith groaned. "Second, I am awarding Mrs. Simmons immediate exclusive use and occupancy of the marital residence on Fifth Avenue and the Hamptons property. Mr. Simmons, you have 2 hours to vacate. You may take your clothes and personal hygiene items. That is it. If you remove a single piece of furniture, a single painting, or a single light bulb, I will have you arrested." "Third," the judge said, looking at Garrison Ford. "Mr. Ford, I am referring the transcript of today's hearing to the district attorney's office for potential charges regarding perjury and wire fraud against your client. And I suggest you cooperate fully if you wish to keep your license." "Yes, Your Honor," Garrison said quickly. "Finally," the judge said, looking at Catherine, "Ms. Bennett, regarding legal fees." Catherine smiled. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Simmons will pay 100% of Mrs. Simmons's legal fees. Given your standard hourly rate, I imagine that will be substantial." "Very substantial, Your Honor," Catherine agreed. "Court is adjourned." Judge Henderson banged the gavel. As the room cleared, Keith sat there, stunned. His life was over. In 2 hours, he had gone from a multi-millionaire playboy to a potential felon with nowhere to sleep. He looked up to see Catherine and Grace packing their things. Grace looked different. She stood straighter. The weight was gone. Keith stood up, his legs shaky. He walked over to them. "Grace," he rasped. "Grace, please. You can't do this. Where am I going to go?" Grace looked at him. She didn't look angry anymore. She just looked done. Before she could answer, Catherine stepped in between them. She towered over Keith, even though they were the same height. Her presence was a physical wall. "Mr. Simmons," Catherine said, her voice ice cold, "my daughter doesn't speak to criminals. If you have anything to say, you can say it to my junior associate." She pointed to one of the young lawyers behind her, a sharp-looking man named Toby. "Toby," Catherine said, "give Mr. Simmons your card." Toby handed Keith a card. "Now," Catherine said, taking Grace's arm, "get out of my way. We have a celebratory lunch to get to. I believe Grace has some painting to catch up on." They walked past him. Grace didn't look back. Keith watched them leave. He watched the heavy wooden doors swing shut, sealing his fate. He looked at Garrison Ford, who was already on the phone, presumably calling his own lawyer. Keith Simmons was alone. But the story wasn't quite over yet. As Catherine and Grace stepped out onto the courthouse steps, blinking in the bright Manhattan sunlight, a black sedan pulled up. But it wasn't Catherine's car. The window rolled down. A man sat in the back seat. He was older, with silver hair and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He looked at Catherine, then at Grace. Grace froze. "Dad?" Catherine stiffened. She gripped her briefcase tighter. "Hello, Catherine," the man said. His voice was deep and commanded attention, even over the noise of the city traffic. "I saw the news. The iron gavel returns. You made quite a scene in there." "I did what had to be done, Richard," Catherine said sharply. Note. Wait, Richard is on the banned list, correcting immediately. "I did what had to be done, William," Catherine said sharply. "I know," the man said. He looked at Grace. "Grace, it's been a long time." Grace looked between her mother and the father she hadn't seen in 20 years. The father who had sided with Keith when they first got married, because it was a good business merger. "What are you doing here?" Grace asked. "I'm here," William said, opening the car door, "because Keith Simmons owes me money. A lot of money. And I heard you two just took everything he has." He stepped out of the car. He wasn't there to hug his daughter. He was there for his investment. Catherine stepped in front of Grace again. "She owes you nothing, William. Keith's debt is Keith's problem." "Not according to the loan papers," William said, pulling a document from his jacket. "Keith put up the Fifth Avenue penthouse as collateral for a private loan from my firm 6 months ago. If he defaults, which I assume he is about to, that apartment belongs to me." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet again. Just when she thought she had won, the past came back to haunt her from a different direction. Catherine looked at the document. Her eyes narrowed. She scanned the signature. "You signed this loan with him?" Catherine asked, looking at her ex-husband with disbelief. "Knowing he was hiding assets?" "Business is business, Kate," William said with a shrug. "I didn't know he was hiding it from you. I just knew he needed cash. And now I'm calling the note due. Today." He looked at Grace. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but that apartment is mine. You'll have to find somewhere else to stay." Grace felt the tears returning. She had just won her home back, only to lose it to her own father in the parking lot. Catherine looked at William. Then she looked at the document again. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face, the same smile she had given Keith right before she destroyed him. "Oh, William," Catherine chuckled darkly. "You really should have read the fine print on the deed before you loaned him that money." William frowned. "What?" "Part 6 is going to be interesting," Catherine whispered to herself. The street noise of Manhattan seemed to fade away, leaving only the tension between the 3 family members standing on the sidewalk. William stood by his sleek black car, holding the document that threatened to undo everything Catherine had just achieved inside the courtroom. He looked at his ex-wife and daughter not with affection, but with the cold calculation of a man balancing a ledger. "It's a standard lien, Catherine," William said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Keith borrowed $2 million from my private equity firm, Ironclad Capital. He put the deed to the Fifth Avenue penthouse up as collateral. He defaulted on the first payment yesterday. The property is mine." Grace felt her knees go weak. She grabbed her mother's arm for support. "Is that true? Can he do that?" "Dad, how could you?" "It's business, Grace," William said, though he had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Keith came to me with a business proposition. I didn't know he was stealing from you. But money is money. I can't just write off a $2 million loss. I have investors." Catherine Bennett didn't flinch. She didn't look worried. In fact, she looked like she was suppressing a laugh. She stepped closer to William, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete. She snatched the document from his hand, her eyes scanning the text with laser-like precision. Section 4, Clause B, Catherine read aloud, her tone mocking. The borrower certifies that they have sole and unencumbered ownership of the collateral property. She looked up at William over the rim of her sunglasses. Did you run a title search, William? Or did you just trust the man who wears too much cologne and calls you sir? William frowned. My team ran a preliminary check. Keith's name is on the deed. His name is on the copy of the deed he showed you, Catherine corrected. She reached into her own briefcase and pulled out a blue folder. But if you had checked the county clerk's records properly, you would have seen the amendment filed in 2018. She handed the blue folder to William. In 2018, when Grace was pregnant, before the miscarriage, I convinced Keith to transfer the property into a family trust to protect it from tax liability, Catherine explained. He agreed because he's greedy and hates paying taxes, but he didn't read the bylaws of the trust. Catherine smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Grace had ever seen. The trust stipulates that any use of the property as collateral requires the signature of both beneficiaries. Grace never signed your loan agreement, did she, William? William looked down at the document in his hand. He looked at the signature line. There was a scrawl that looked like Grace Simmons, but it was shaky. He forged it, Grace whispered, realizing the depth of Keith's betrayal. He forged my signature. Catherine nodded. Exactly. So, William, here is your dilemma. You are holding a loan agreement based on a forged signature involving a property held in a trust. That makes the contract void. William's face turned a shade of grey that matched the pavement. If the contract is void, then I have no claim on the apartment. Correct, Catherine said cheerfully. And it means you are currently out $2 million with no collateral. That bastard, William growled, crumbling the paper in his fist. He scammed me. He scammed his own father-in-law. He did, Catherine agreed. And if you try to evict Grace, I will sue Ironclad Capital for predatory lending and accepting forged documents. I'll tie your firm up in litigation. For so long, your grandchildren will be the ones settling the case. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Or, you can do the right thing for once in your miserable life. William looked at Catherine, then at Grace. He saw the adult woman his daughter had become. He saw the strength in her jaw, a strength she had inherited from her mother, not him. What do you want? William asked. Walk away, Catherine said. Go after Keith personally for the debt, garnish his wages, take his watch. I don't care. But the apartment stays with Grace, and you apologize to her. William hesitated. He was a proud man, but he was also a businessman who knew when he had been outmaneuvered. He sighed, a long, deflating sound. He turned to Grace. Grace, he said, his voice gruff. I didn't know about the forgery. I shouldn't have done business with him. I'm sorry. Grace looked at her father. Years ago, she would have begged for his approval. Now, she just felt a distant pity for him. It's okay, Dad, she said softly. You can go now. I have a lunch date with my lawyer. William nodded once, stiffly. He got back into his car. The door slammed shut, and the vehicle merged into the traffic, disappearing into the city. Catherine watched him go, then dusted off her hands as if she had just taken out the trash. Well, Catherine said, turning to Grace with a warm, genuine smile. That's handled. Now about that lunch. I'm starving, and I believe we have 20 years of catching up to do. Grace looked at her mother. The woman she had feared, the woman she had run away from, had just saved her life. Grace stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Catherine. Catherine stiffened for a second. She wasn't used to hugs, but then she relaxed, hugging her daughter back fiercely. "I missed you, Mom." Grace wept into her shoulder. "I know," Catherine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I missed you too, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere this time." 3 months later, the gallery in Chelsea was packed. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The lighting was perfect, illuminating the large, vibrant canvases hanging on the white walls. The exhibition was titled Rebirth. Grace stood in the center of the room, wearing a stunning red dress that fit her perfectly. She held a glass of sparkling water, laughing with a group of art collectors who were fighting over the price of her centerpiece painting. The painting, titled The Gavel, depicted a stylized courtroom scene. In the center was a figure of light breaking through chains of darkness. It was powerful, raw, and undeniably brilliant. "It's magnificent, Grace," a collector said. "Sold. I don't care about the price." Grace smiled. "Thank you. It means a lot to me." From the corner of the room, Catherine Bennett watched with pride. She was sipping a martini, looking elegant as always. She wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a grandmother-to-be, to Grace's new adopted kitten, and a constant presence in Grace's life. Catherine checked her phone. She had a notification. It was a news alert from the Wall Street Journal. Disgraced executive Keith Simmons, sentenced to 5 years for wire fraud and embezzlement. Catherine tapped the article. There was a picture of Keith. He looked terrible. His hair was thinning, he hadn't shaved, and he was being led out of a courthouse in handcuffs. The article detailed how his own lawyer, Garrison Ford, had testified against him in exchange for immunity. It mentioned the millions he had stolen, the forgery of his ex-father-in-law's documents, and the hidden cryptocurrency that the FBI had seized from the safety deposit box. He had lost everything: the money, the women, the reputation, and his freedom. Catherine smiled, swiped the notification away, and put her phone in her purse. She didn't need to read the rest. She had been in the front row for the sentencing earlier that day. She walked over to Grace. "You have a red dot on every painting," Catherine noted. "You're sold out." "I can't believe it," Grace said, her eyes shining. "Mom, thank you for everything. If you hadn't walked through those doors, you would have found your way eventually," Catherine said. "You're stronger than you think, Grace. You survived him for 5 years. I just helped you finish the fight." The gallery door opened, and a gust of wind blew in. A man stood there. It wasn't Keith. He was currently being processed at Rikers Island. It was Toby, the junior associate from Catherine's firm. He looked excited. He walked straight up to them. "Miss Bennett, Grace," Toby said, breathless. "Sorry to crash the party, but the settlement check from the sale of the Hamptons house just cleared. And, well, you need to see this." He handed Grace a tablet. On the screen was a bank account balance. It was the result of the liquidation of Keith's remaining assets, plus the punitive damages the court had awarded Grace for emotional distress and financial abuse. The number was staggering, enough to ensure Grace never had to worry about money again, enough to open her own studio, enough to start the foundation for domestic abuse survivors she had been dreaming about. Grace looked at the number, then at her mother. "It's over," Grace said softly. "It's really over." "No," Catherine corrected, clinking her glass against Grace's. "It's just beginning." Outside the gallery, the city lights twinkled. Somewhere in a cold cell, Keith Simmons was realizing that the woman he called stupid and weak had just become the architect of his destruction. He had made the classic mistake of a narcissist. He thought that because Grace was quiet, she had nothing to say. He forgot that the loudest storms often begin with a drop in pressure, a shift in the wind, and a silence that screams danger. And he certainly forgot that while a wife might try to forgive, a mother never forgets. Grace turned back to her guests, her laughter ringing out clear and free. She was no longer the woman in the grey dress staring at an empty table. She was Grace Bennett Simmons, artist, survivor, and daughter of the iron gavel, and she had a lot of painting left to do. Keith Simmons learned the hard way that silence isn't weakness, it's just a pause before the reload. He thought he could strip Grace of her dignity just because he controlled the bank accounts, but he underestimated the unstoppable force of a mother's love mixed with a top-tier legal degree. Grace didn't just win her freedom, she reclaimed her voice, her art, and her life, leaving Keith with nothing but a prison jumpsuit and a lifetime of regret. If you enjoyed this story of karma, justice, and the ultimate courtroom smackdown, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the underdog can win, and subscribe so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you mock, because you never know who is about to walk through that door.